Today we're going to be looking at the principles behind the Preaching the Epistles, or the letters of the New Testament. These letters make up the bulk of the New Testament. It's not hard to preach them, but I want to take a moment or two and just review some of the principles of preaching that affect particularly the epistles before you try to preach them.
Today we're going to look at preaching the epistles, or the letters of the New Testament. The epistles include the Pauline epistles, those written by Paul, which include Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians, and Timothy, and Titus, and Philemon. The non-Pauline epistles, those that are probably not written by Paul, are Hebrews, though some believe it was written by Paul, James, Peter, and John, and Jude. Paul's epistles may be broken into two groups as well. The first group are the pastoral epistles. These are written to churches or to groups of churches. They include the book of Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Thessalonians. The other group are the personal epistles. Those were written to individuals. They include Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. Now, preaching the letters or the epistles are really fairly straightforward. Nevertheless, there's a few principles that you need to remember. First, remember that the epistles are practical and not poetic. They speak to the real needs of the churches of the time. Second, remember that epistles should be read in context. That is, know when they fit in history and the story. This is very, very important. I recommend that before you preach any part of an epistle, that you take a few moments and read the entire epistle, read the entire book, so that you can see the context of that book. And I suggest you do it every time. Know when they fit, and then read them secondarily, not primarily, for our times. Remember that he's speaking to these real churches, and we've got to take what he says and interpret him for our day. Let me try to illustrate that. Let's suppose that we're standing by a wall, overhearing a conversation between two people. These two people are very smart and they're very intelligent, and we're looking for whatever we can learn from whatever they say to each other. But as they whisper to each other, they also talk about personal matters, where they're going to eat, what they're going to do the next day, etc. Listening to them talk about where they're going to eat does not mean that we have to run down to the same restaurant. Rather, we listen for the principles that they're talking about. We listen for the things that are universal. And the same thing is true in the letters of Paul. We need to listen to them for the universal truths they speak to our day. Not to be slavish imitators of everything that Paul says to the churches, but to listen carefully for the Word of God that speaks to us today and how it affects our lives, not just theirs. And finally, read them with grace in mind. Do not turn the epistles into a new law. Paul was writing instructions to the churches that affect within the context of the times. We must understand those contexts as we understand his theology in order to make sense out of how it applies to us today. We can't simply say that because it is written in Corinthians in a particular way that it is a universal principle. We must understand the principles behind what Paul has written so that we can apply them fairly and equally to our time today.
As I said, preaching the epistles is an easy exercise compared to the preaching of some other passages. Nevertheless, we must always preach them within the context of the times they were written and with God's grace in mind.